What happens when the man everyone recognizes feels invisible inside? What happens when success arrives before healing, and applause replaces peace? And what happens when the role that makes you famous quietly erases the person you really are? Today, we're exploring the deeply personal and rarely discussed story of Demond Wilson, the beloved Lamont Sanford from Sanford and Son, a man who made millions laugh while privately unraveling in silence. Before his passing at age 79, Wilson revealed truths that weren't glamorous, weren't comforting, and weren't meant for those who only want inspirational endings. His story isn't really about fame. It's about what fame costs, what trauma hides, and what happens when someone finally admits they're lost, even while standing at the top. Let me ask you something. Have you ever looked successful on the outside while struggling deeply on the inside? Have you ever felt trapped by who people believed you were supposed to be? That was Demond Wilson's reality for years. America's Son, the rise of Lamont Sanford. In the early 1970s, American television barely reflected American life. Most sitcoms revolved around tidy homes, predictable families, and problems that resolved neatly in 30 minutes. For millions of viewers, especially black families, television didn't feel like it belonged to them. Then in 1972, everything shifted. Sanford and Son arrived. Loud, messy, emotional, and unapologetically real. The show followed a father and son running a junkyard in Watts, Los Angeles. The father, Fred Sanford, played by Red Fox, was explosive, manipulative, and endlessly theatrical. But the emotional backbone of the series was his son, Lamont Sanford, portrayed by Demond Wilson. Lamont wasn't flashy. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't a clown. He was patient, restrained, weary, the son who absorbed chaos while trying to hold things together. He represented responsibility, loyalty, and quiet frustration. And because of that, he felt real. Viewers didn't just laugh at Lamont, they trusted him. Within months, Sanford and Son became one of the most watched shows in America. At its peak, more than 30 million people tuned in every week. Families gathered around their televisions. Children mimicked Fred's dramatic feigned heart attacks. Adults debated storylines at work the next day. Lamont Sanford became America's son, steady, familiar, comforting. But here's what few people ever stopped to consider. Who was Demond Wilson when the cameras stopped rolling? Because while audiences saw warmth and humor, the man behind the character was carrying something far heavier than anyone imagined. Before Hollywood, a childhood on stage and in faith. Demond Wilson wasn't new to performing. Born in 1946, he grew up in Harlem surrounded by music, faith, and community. By age 4, he was already appearing on stage. By 12, he had performed at Harlem's Apollo Theater, one of the most legendary venues in black entertainment history. Yet his childhood wasn't only shaped by applause. It was also shaped by spirituality. He attended Catholic church services regularly and spent summers at Pentecostal revivals with his grandmother. Faith wasn't a phase. It was woven into his identity. At one point, he even considered becoming a priest. But no amount of prayer, discipline, or early success prepared him for what happened next. At just 19 years old, Demond Wilson was drafted into the Vietnam War. And everything changed. Vietnam, the trauma no applause could heal. From 1966 to 1968, Wilson served in the U.S. Army's 4th Infantry Division. He spent over a year in combat zones, navigating jungles, ambushes, explosions, and constant fear. He was wounded in battle and awarded both the Bronze Star and Purple Heart. On paper, those medals represented courage and honor. In reality, they marked the beginning of something far darker. Wilson returned home with recurring nightmares, panic attacks, emotional volatility, and deep despair. Symptoms we now recognize as PTSD, but which were barely understood at the time. There were no structured counseling programs, no trauma-informed therapy sessions, no public conversations about invisible wounds. Veterans were expected to move on. He couldn't. So he turned to drugs, not for pleasure, but for silence. For sleep. For distance from memories that wouldn't loosen their grip. Here's a question worth pausing on. How many people carry trauma so heavy that no success, recognition, or money can undo it? Wilson later admitted that heroin and other substances became his coping mechanism long before Hollywood ever noticed him. Yet despite his pain, he still believed his life had purpose. He refused to surrender to despair. So he returned to acting. Broadway. Off-Broadway. Auditions that went nowhere. Roles that barely paid. Long days. Little recognition. But he kept going, driven not by fame, but by survival and a stubborn sense that his life wasn't meant to end in silence. Hollywood, however, wasn't welcoming. Opportunities for black actors were scarce, especially for those without powerful connections. Then, in 1971, Wilson landed a small guest role on All in the Family. It lasted only minutes, but it changed everything. Producers noticed him. Within a year, Demond Wilson was cast as Lamont Sanford. And suddenly, the struggling veteran became America's most recognizable son. Sanford and Son, fame at full speed. When Sanford and Son premiered, it didn't feel like traditional television. It wasn't sanitized. It wasn't gentle. It was loud, emotional, imperfect, and deeply human. Audiences loved it. The chemistry between Redd Foxx and Demond Wilson became legendary. Foxx was explosive, sarcastic, and unpredictable. Wilson was grounded, controlled, emotionally steady. Their contrast created depth beyond comedy. Lamont didn't just react. He absorbed chaos, mediated conflict, and anchored the story's emotional heart. Behind the scenes, Wilson was still in his early 20s, acting alongside a seasoned comedy legend. But instead of competing, he became the stabilizing rhythm of the show. His quiet strength made Lamont unforgettable. Within a few years, Wilson became one of the highest-paid actors on television, earning around $40,000 per week, an astonishing amount in the 1970s. He bought a 27-room mansion in Bel Air. He drove luxury cars. He moved through elite Hollywood circles. From wounded soldier to sitcom icon, his story looked like the American dream. But here's where the story turns. What if success doesn't fix what's broken inside? What if fame actually makes the emptiness louder? Because while Wilson's career soared, his private world slowly collapsed. Addiction, affairs, and emotional collapse. Behind the mansion gates, Demond Wilson wasn't celebrating. He was unraveling. The trauma from Vietnam never healed. Fame didn't soothe it, it amplified it. The pressure of public identity became suffocating. Everywhere he went, people called him Lamont. Not Demond. Lamont. He began to feel like the character had swallowed the person. Who was he when he wasn't funny? Who was he when the audience wasn't watching? Who was he when the applause stopped? Those questions haunted him. Wilson later admitted he was spending about $1,000 a week on cocaine, on top of years of heroin use after returning from war. Drugs weren't indulgence. They were anesthesia. They were survival tools for emotional pain he didn't know how to confront. At the same time, his marriage deteriorated. He engaged in repeated affairs, driven not by passion but by emptiness, loneliness, and impulsivity. He once said darkly, "All Satan had to say was, 'Go have an affair,' and I'd respond, 'With whom?'" It was humor, but the kind that hides despair. His wife, Cicely Johnston, couldn't endure the chaos. Their home became luxurious but cold, expansive but emotionally vacant. Wilson fell into severe depression, increasingly disgusted with himself, increasingly exhausted by the disconnect between who he was and who the world thought he was. Later, he admitted something haunting. "The more money I made, the more my life fell apart." Let that sit for a moment. Have you ever reached something you worked for your entire life, only to realize it didn't bring what you thought it would? Every week, Wilson walked onto set smiling, delivering laughter to millions. But when the cameras shut off, he returned home empty, restless, and ashamed. Lamont Sanford brought warmth to the world. Demond Wilson felt hollow inside. And the collapse wasn't finished. Betrayal, crime, and Hollywood's dark side. Even at the height of Sanford and Son, cracks formed. In 1974, Redd Foxx abruptly walked off the show over contract disputes. Wilson didn't hear it from Foxx himself. He learned about it in a hallway from a broadcaster. The betrayal stung deeply. Though Fox eventually returned and they reconciled, Wilson later admitted, "I forgave him and loved him, but I never forgot." Trust, once broken, never fully returned. Then something far darker happened. In 1983, Wilson's manager and close associate, Ray Wren Wilson, was brutally murdered amid financial disputes connected to the Cotton Club. Wilson later testified in court, describing the night his manager begged him to follow a limousine because he sensed danger. Standing in that courtroom, Wilson saw another side of Hollywood, a world where money, power, crime, and violence could exist behind the illusion of glamour and success. Whatever faith he still had in the industry collapsed. And then came the moment that changed everything. The tennis court, where everything finally broke. May 1982. DeMond Wilson stood alone on the tennis court inside his Bel Air mansion. He was waiting for friends. No one came. His wife was hospitalized. His neighbors lived far away. The massive estate around him felt eerily empty, like a monument to isolation rather than success. And suddenly, something devastating hit him. He had everything, and no one. No laughter. No audience. No character to hide behind. Just a man alone with decades of unresolved trauma, addiction, regret, and grief. In that moment, Wilson dropped to his knees and prayed. "Lord Jesus, if you restore my family, if you help me find myself again, I will change my life." There were no cameras, no applause, no audience, just desperation. And something inside him finally cracked, not in destruction, but in surrender. He later said it wasn't a miracle. It was an awakening. For the first time in years, he didn't numb pain. He didn't run from memory. He didn't perform. He faced himself. Let me ask you, have you ever reached a moment where you knew, without doubt, that if you didn't change, your life would collapse? That was Wilson's moment. And unlike many, he listened. Walking away, the decision that shocked Hollywood. Wilson didn't treat that night as emotional theater. He treated it as a turning point. He immersed himself in faith, studied scripture deeply, met regularly with pastors, entered counseling, cut off drugs, alcohol, and destructive relationships. Within 6 months, he lost over 35 pounds, not through dieting, but through abandoning a lifestyle that had been killing him. Then he did something that stunned Hollywood. He walked away. At the height of his fame, when offers were still coming and residual checks were still flowing, Wilson stepped back from mainstream entertainment. He didn't vanish, he redirected. He became a minister. He wrote books about faith, recovery, and redemption. He began speaking to churches, veterans, and struggling men, not as a celebrity, but as a survivor. People couldn't understand it. Why walk away from millions? Why abandon fame? Why leave the spotlight when you finally earned it? But Wilson knew something others didn't. Fame had almost killed him. And peace was worth more than applause. A different kind of legacy. In later years, Wilson spoke openly about his addiction, trauma, mistakes, and recovery. He never painted himself as perfect. He never rewrote his story to sound cleaner than it was. Instead, he told the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. He admitted he'd hurt people. He admitted he'd failed. He admitted he'd nearly destroyed himself. But he also admitted something else. That healing was possible, even after decades of pain. That identity didn't have to remain trapped in past mistakes. That redemption didn't require fame. That peace didn't demand applause. His legacy wasn't just Lamont Sanford. It was survival. It was transformation. It was the quiet courage to choose healing over validation. Final questions. For all of us. So let me leave you with this. What happens when success comes before healing? What happens when applause replaces peace? What happens when the world loves your mask but never sees your wounds? And more importantly, what happens when someone finally chooses themselves? Not the image, not the fame, not the applause, but the truth. DeMond Wilson's story reminds us that laughter can hide pain, that success can mask trauma, and that even the brightest lights can cast the darkest shadows. But it also reminds us of something else. That it's never too late to stop performing. Never too late to heal. Never too late to become who you were before the world told you who you had to be. And maybe the real question isn't what happened to Demond Wilson. Maybe it's this. What part of yourself have you been hiding? And what would happen if you finally stopped? He didn't whisper it. He didn't soften it. He didn't explain it. He said it plainly, like a man pronouncing the end of a life he could no longer survive inside. And then, in 1983, he did something that stunned the entertainment world. He walked away from Hollywood. Not slowly. Not strategically. Not temporarily. Completely. No farewell tour. No farewell interviews. No carefully worded press release about taking time off. Just silence. At a time when he still had recognition, money, influence, and opportunity. When most actors cling harder to the spotlight, Demond Wilson chose obscurity over addiction, faith over fame, and truth over applause. Many people called it career suicide. He called it survival. And maybe that raises a deeper, more unsettling question. How many people stay in environments that destroy them simply because walking away feels scarier than staying? Wilson chose the harder road. And almost no one noticed. Fame, success, and the quiet collapse no one saw. From the outside, Demond Wilson's life looked like a dream. Millions of households welcomed him into their living rooms each week through Sanford and Son, one of the most successful sitcoms of the 1970s. His portrayal of Lamont Sanford, patient, grounded, endlessly tolerant of chaos, became iconic. The show shattered ratings records, reshaped television comedy, and helped normalize black-led series at a time when representation was still rare. But behind the laugh track, something darker was unfolding. Wilson wasn't just tired. He was unraveling. He carried unresolved trauma from Vietnam. He battled addiction. He struggled with infidelity. His marriage strained. His mental health deteriorated. And yet, on screen, he was expected to smile, joke, perform, entertain, and remain endlessly grateful for his success. Here's the uncomfortable truth Hollywood rarely discusses. Applause can hide suffering. Success can camouflage pain. And fame can make loneliness feel louder, not quieter. Wilson once admitted he felt more isolated at the height of his popularity than he ever did before fame arrived. Surrounded by people, but known by no one. Admired by millions, yet disconnected from himself. So here's another question. What happens when the world celebrates you, but you don't recognize yourself anymore? For Wilson, the answer came slowly at first, then all at once. The breaking point. When survival becomes more urgent than success. By the early 1980s, Wilson's life had become unrecognizable even to himself. The money didn't bring peace. The fame didn't bring fulfillment. The admiration didn't bring belonging. Instead, everything felt heavier. The pressure to perform. The expectations. The emotional exhaustion of pretending to be okay. The constant fear that if he stopped smiling, stopped entertaining, stopped being useful, he would be discarded. And eventually, something inside him broke. He later described feeling spiritually bankrupt, successful on paper, but empty at the core. The very thing he once prayed for, recognition, had become the thing threatening to destroy him. And that's when he said the sentence that ended one life, and began another. The old Demond Wilson is dead. Not because he wanted to shock anyone. Not because he wanted attention. But because he knew something essential. You cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. So he left. Not gradually. Not carefully. Not cautiously. He sold his mansion. Abandoned the Hollywood lifestyle. Walked away from producers, contracts, casting calls, and fame itself. And moved his wife and 6 children to a quiet lakeside neighborhood. Far from studios, paparazzi, and red carpets. Let's pause here for a moment. How many people feel trapped in lives that look successful but feel unbearable, and never find the courage to leave? Wilson didn't leave because he failed. He left because he wanted to live. A new life, ministry, marriage, and meaning. Contrary to what critics expected, Wilson didn't vanish into bitterness or obscurity. He rebuilt. Slowly. Deliberately. Quietly. Away from applause. Away from cameras. Away from validation. He became an ordained minister, not symbolically, but through serious theological training and service. He reconciled with his wife. Together, they raised 6 children in stability, discipline, and faith. He prioritized family dinners over film premieres, fishing trips over auditions, prayer over parties. Instead of scripts, he studied scripture. Instead of chasing roles, he chased healing. Instead of being admired, he learned how to be known. And perhaps most surprising of all, he didn't regret leaving fame. He once said, "I was more famous than fulfilled. And I had to choose." That sentence carries more wisdom than many careers. Because it forces a hard question. Would you choose peace over recognition, even if it meant losing everything people admired about you? Wilson did. And in doing so, he found something Hollywood never gave him. Peace. From celebrity to counselor, serving without applause. After leaving entertainment, Wilson began traveling, not as a star, but as a minister, speaker, counselor, and mentor. He preached in churches, spoke in prisons, visited veterans' hospitals, held recovery meetings. He talked openly about trauma, addiction, identity, broken marriages, and self-destruction, not to entertain, but to prevent others from following the same path. And what made his message powerful wasn't his fame. It was his honesty. He didn't preach perfection. He preached survival. He didn't speak from superiority. He spoke from scars. He told people the truth. That success doesn't heal trauma. That money doesn't fix identity. That applause doesn't equal love. That you can lose your way even when everyone thinks you've made it. And perhaps most importantly, that walking away from something destructive is not failure. It's wisdom. Let me ask you something. How many people confuse endurance with strength, and stay in environments that quietly kill them because quitting feels shameful? Wilson redefined quitting. For him, leaving wasn't surrender. It was self-rescue. Writing, reflection, and reinvention. Wilson didn't stop creating. He simply changed what he created. Instead of sitcoms, he wrote books. Instead of scripts, he wrote sermons. Instead of jokes, he wrote truth. He authored more than a dozen books about spirituality, identity, recovery, transformation, and meaning. His memoir Second Banana revealed the emotional cost of fame, not glamorized, not softened, but raw and honest. He admitted that wealth hadn't healed him, it had complicated him. That success hadn't freed him, it had trapped him. That recognition hadn't filled him, it had distracted him from his wounds. But instead of regret, he chose reflection. Instead of bitterness, he chose responsibility. Instead of nostalgia, he chose growth. And here's the deeper question. Can someone truly reinvent themselves after decades in the spotlight? Or does fame always define the final chapter? Wilson believed it didn't have to. And his life became proof. Restoration House. Turning pain into purpose. In 1994, Wilson founded the Restoration House of America, a non-profit dedicated to helping former prisoners reintegrate into society through housing, counseling, job training, and mentorship. No cameras. No press conferences. No awards ceremonies. Just quiet work. Hundreds of men found second chances through programs he supported, rebuilding lives after addiction, incarceration, and hopelessness. This part of his life never made headlines. It didn't trend. It didn't go viral. But maybe that's the point. Because some of the most meaningful lives are lived where no one is watching. So let me ask you, which legacy matters more? The one people applaud, or the one that quietly changes lives? Wilson answered that question with action. The final years, a man no longer performing. Though he largely stepped away from acting, Wilson occasionally appeared in interviews, not to revive his fame, but to tell the truth. He spoke openly about Vietnam trauma, addiction, infidelity, depression, loneliness, the emotional cost of celebrity, the dangers of unresolved wounds. He wanted people to understand something essential. Success does not heal trauma. Money does not fix identity. Applause does not equal love. And perhaps most importantly, you can lose your way even when everyone thinks you've made it. Unlike many celebrities who chase comebacks, Wilson showed no desire to reclaim the spotlight. He wasn't bitter toward Hollywood, but he wasn't nostalgic either. He had outgrown performance. He had chosen peace over praise, healing over headlines, truth over attention. And that's a transformation few people ever achieve, famous or not. A quiet passing, a loud legacy. Lamont Wilson passed away in January 2026 at age 79 after a long battle with prostate cancer. There were no red carpets, no grand ceremonies, no public spectacle, just family, faith, and a life fully lived, not for fame, but for meaning. He left behind his wife of over 5 decades, 6 children, and a legacy far deeper than Lamont Sanford. Yes, he reshaped American television. Yes, he broke barriers. Yes, he made millions laugh. But his greatest legacy wasn't entertainment. It was transformation. The hidden truth behind Hollywood success. Lamont Wilson's story forces uncomfortable questions. Not about fame, but about humanity. Why do we assume fame equals happiness? Why do we celebrate success stories but ignore survival stories? Why do we rarely ask what people lose while making it? Wilson once said Hollywood didn't destroy him, unhealed trauma did. Fame simply amplified what was already broken. That insight matters. Because his story isn't really about celebrity. It's about what happens when wounded people are handed power, money, recognition, and pressure, without healing. It's about how applause replaces connection. And how being seen becomes mistaken for being known. Let me ask you something personal. How many people around you are successful, but suffering quietly? And more importantly, how many people around you feel unseen, even while being watched? Wilson's life reminds us. Visibility is not intimacy. Recognition is not belonging. And success is not salvation. What can we learn from Lamont Wilson? His life quietly teaches several truths. Trauma doesn't disappear when success arrives. It hides better. Fame magnifies emptiness instead of filling it. You can be admired by millions and still feel completely alone. Walking away from something destructive is not failure. It's wisdom. Healing begins when performance ends. Wilson didn't just change careers. He changed identities. He stopped being a character and started being a man. That took courage most people never summon. Because it's one thing to chase success. It's another thing to admit success is killing you. And it's something else entirely to walk away from it. So here's another question worth sitting with. If your life looks impressive to others but feels unbearable to you, which truth matters more? Wilson chose the truth. And it saved him. The man behind Lamont Sanford. When audiences remember Lamont Wilson, they remember Lamont Sanford. Patient, grounded, endlessly tolerant of chaos. But the man behind that role lived a far more complex story. He was a child performer, a war veteran, an addict, a superstar, a broken husband, a survivor, a minister, a father, a mentor, a man who nearly died in loneliness, and instead chose transformation. And maybe that's the most powerful part of his story. Not that he became famous, but that he walked away when fame almost destroyed him. The question he faced alone, and the one we all eventually face. Lamont Wilson once stood alone on a tennis court in 1982. Exhausted, spiritually empty, emotionally fractured, and asked himself a question that changed everything. Who am I without applause? He didn't ask it publicly. He didn't post it online. He didn't workshop it in interviews. He sat with it and answered it. By leaving, by choosing faith, by choosing healing, by choosing obscurity over destruction, by choosing truth over validation. And that choice saved his life. So let me leave you with this. If everything in your life disappeared, your job, your reputation, your money, your titles, who would you still be? Lamont Wilson faced that question. And he survived the answer. Would you? Final reflection. The courage to walk away. At the height of his career, Demond Wilson shocked Hollywood by doing something almost unheard of. He quit. No farewell tour. No comeback plans. No safety net. He sold his mansion. Gave up luxury. Moved his wife and 6 children to a quiet lakeside neighborhood far from studios, paparazzi, and red carpets. Why? Because fame felt like a treadmill. Exhausting, hollow, and disconnected from real life.